goody.
Alright, what's going on everybody? Zombies here again, and today we're back with another Marvel Snap video. So today we're doing a tier list. Haven't done one of these in kind of a long time, but thought it'd be fun to take a look at all of the season pass cards we've gotten since the game first came out in beta in the summer of last year, up until this month's release in Loki. So we have 16 season pass cards here. This will be kind of a fun trip down memory lane, and maybe this will provide some interesting information if you're a newer player who wasn't really around when some of these cards first released. First up, we have Wave. Wave's the very first season pass card launching in June of last year. Wave is a 3/3 that reads, on reveal, all cards cost 4 during the next turn. This is an interesting one, and I think one of the most impactful season pass cards we've ever had. Now, obviously, these first few season pass cards ended up making their way into Series 3 rather quickly, as Series 4 and 5 didn't exist back then. So I'm sure a lot of people don't really view these as season pass cards if you started playing at the launch of the game, but they were still pass cards nonetheless. Wave is a really interesting one. She formed a whole archetype around her in Death Wave, which was a pretty popular and powerful deck, especially later down the line when things like She-Hulk released, and this card did eventually get nerfed before you were able to combine the cost-reducing effects with Wave. So if you had a Death or a She-Hulk, you reduced its cost, it would be set to 4, and then the cost reduction would apply. So you were able to cheat out Death and She-Hulk during a Wave turn, which was super duper powerful. But this was eventually nerfed for design-based reasons, and to make it so that they could print other cost reduction effects in the future without having to worry about the Wave interactions. To me, Wave is one of the easiest ones of the bunch to rate. I think Wave is an easy S tier. Next up, we have Thor, the God of Thunder. Fun fact, in beta, I was a pretty casual player, and this is the only season pass I actually purchased in beta. I think I spent a grand total of like $15 in beta, and 10 of that was on the Thor season pass. And also another fun fact, Thor was not originally a 3/4 when he first released. Thor was actually a 4-cost 6 power with the same effect with shuffling Mjolnir into your deck and getting the +6 power if you draw it and play it. But yeah, this card was actually a lot worse when it came out. 4 mana was just really slow for Thor, and it also gave you one less turn to have a chance of actually drawing the hammer to make him a better stat for cost card. And another thing worth noting is that Jane Foster was not released yet, so you actually didn't have that kind of synergy in being able to more consistently draw your hammer every game if you happen to draw Jane after Thor. The buff to the card was pretty impactful and I think a good decision overall, and though he doesn't see play in a ton of decks right now, he is a mainstay in the Lockjaw archetype. And so for me, I'm going to be putting Thor in the B tier here as a overall solid card that is rather fun to play and very thematic. Next up, we have Daredevil. Daredevil is a 2-cost 2 power that on turn 5, you get to see what your opponent is playing before you lock in your actions for the turn. I think this is a really awesome design. As far as thematic designs go, I don't think you could really pick a better themed design for this card. And initially, this card saw play in a ton of places. The main one around launch or so was the ongoing Destroyer deck with Professor X, using Daredevil to kind of help guarantee you're going to not have to guess on the X lane on turn 5, and then be able to close out the game with either a big Destroyer or a Spectrum to buff all your other ongoings. As lane lockdown has got a bit worse over time, Daredevil's play has been reduced, but I still think it is a solid card in the right deck, and if nothing else, just a very fun card to play. For that reason, I'm going to be putting him right alongside Thor in the B tier. Next up, we have the final season pass card of the beta, and that was Nick Fury. So this is not Nick Fury's original form. Originally, he was a 5-cost 7 power with the same effect of, on reveal, add 3 6-cost cards to your hand. So originally, when Nick Fury came out, he was bad. This card really just did not have much of a home. Some people like to run him in Dino decks, but 5 cost for the effect when a lot of the 6-drops in the game were kind of underwhelming and you'd rather be running your own 6-drop if you want to play a 6-drop, it just wasn't cutting it for the card. However, he did get a buff to a 4/5 right around the time of the Nick Fury show releasing earlier this year, and that was a pretty impactful change. Nick Fury suddenly is a card that can be played cheaper with Zabu, and even just at 4 mana, it's a lot more reasonable of a card to play in a deck, as the difference between 4 and 5 mana in this game is pretty huge. Even now, some people are running him in their Dino or Loki decks just as a way for more card generation to pump up the big payoffs in their decks. And I think it's pretty thematic and fun design. Some people aren't going to like the RNG, but I think that's just the nature of the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. cards. So yeah, overall, even though Nick Fury got off to a bit of a slow start, I think he has a good place in the game. A lot of people enjoy playing the card, and for that reason, I'm going to be putting it down into the C tier, just a little bit lower than things like Thor and Daredevil. Then we have Miles Morales Spider-Man. So this was the first Season Pass card during the global launch of the game, and I think Miles is a pretty great example of how a card can be powerful, but until the right pieces and additions are printed, it might not end up seeing the true extent of that power. So Miles is a 4-cost 5 power that reads, if a card moved last turn, this costs 1. So this card didn't really see a whole ton of play on release, and the main reason for that was I think the quality of move cards and move decks was just kind of low at the time. Full move decks were just really underpowered compared to the rest of the field, and we just didn't have enough generally good cards that had move effects to justify putting this in decks that weren't super focused around the move theme. However, over time, this changed. And probably the two biggest things that helped this card were the addition of cards like Jeff the Baby Landshark and Silk, giving you a lot of movement effects throughout a lot of different turns of the game. The Spider-Man rework also helped this as well, as another just powerful 3-drop that impacts the board, moves stuff around, and enables your Miles. So even though he got off to a bit of a slow start, I think Miles is a pretty core reason why a lot of these tempo move decks have worked, as 1/5s are really strong. And it's cool to see how, even though the card wasn't as impactful when it came out, it now has a very, very relevant place in the overall metagame and a specific type of decks. For that reason, I'm going to be putting Miles up here in the A tier. We have the November Pass card in Black Panther, a 5/4 that reads, on reveal, double this card's power. So Panther was kind of a linear combo style of card, and it really only found homes in the on-reveal archetype with things like Wong or Zola, or just dedicated combo decks that were trying to use Zola and Panther as like their top end to get a bunch of power into 2 lanes. They've always been rather telegraphed and fairly easy to counter, so I don't think Black Panther has ever really been at the top of the metagame. He did get a bit of a boost when Shuri came out, especially before her nerf, when you could put her in another lane, then buff up the Panther and Zola it for even bigger stats. However, I think this is just kind of a middle of the pack kind of card. Recently, I know I've played this quite a bit in Mr. Negative as well. I think it's kind of underrated there. But those are really the main homes this card has had. It hasn't really seen a whole ton of play elsewhere. So overall, I think it's a decent card that is kind of limited into the decks it sees play, but it does have some powerful combo potential, and for that reason, we're going to be putting it into B tier. Now we're starting to get into some of the more broken of the bunch, and Silver Surfer, well, he's definitely one of the top of that list. So Silver Surfer is a 3/2 that reads, on reveal, give your other 3-cost cards +2 power. Now when this card originally released in December of last year, it was a 3/0 that gave your other 3-cost cards +3 power, and man was it busted. As we've seen recently with the whole Forge Brood shenanigans, turns out giving +3 power to Brood or other 3-drops is really, really strong. And at the time, having a 0 power himself enabled him to be run very effectively in Mr. Negative style decks. I still maintain that Surfer is one of the most busted season pass cards that has ever released, and it was kind of a rough season if you did not have access to it, or if you were just missing a key piece of the puzzle like Brood to get more 3-drops into play. After the nerfs it received, the card has still been fairly relevant, popping up and down in the tiers, and I think is overall a bit more balanced card, though not really standing at the top of the metagame, but also not really standing towards the bottom of it. And Surfer decks have consistently been one of the more popular archetypes that a lot of people seem to really like in the community. For that reason, I'm going to be putting Silver Surfer in the A tier. Next up, we have maybe the most broken season pass card ever, and that is Zabu. Zabu right now is a 2/2 that reads, ongoing, your 4-cost cards cost 1 less. However, for anyone who wasn't around when Zabu originally came out, this is one of the most degenerate cards that has ever been released in Marvel Snap in its entirety. Originally, Zabu was a 3/2 with ongoing, your 4-cost cards cost 2 less, And man, as we're seeing now with Loki plus Quinjet, 2 cost reduction on more expensive cards is really, really broken, it turns out. Zabu season is probably the closest I have ever been to quitting Marble Snap. The game essentially boiled down to, do I have Zabu on 3? Does my opponent not have Zabu on 3? Well, I'm probably going to win the game. And it just was disgusting. It was not a great time to be playing Marble Snap. Silver Surfer in its unnerfed form was putting up some competition, but just the raw numbers output of Zabu was actually insane. This card had such a warping effect on the game as a whole, it got nerfed only a few days after the season it came out in ended, alongside Silver Surfer. And the developers even had to publish a whole little mini blog saying they understand the importance and impact of nerfing season pass cards. It was that much of a disaster. Even after its nerfs though, Zabu has been an archetype defining card that is still really powerful and something a lot of players seem to still enjoy playing with. It's just nowhere near as hilariously broken as it was on release, and the game is better off for it. So for all those reasons, Zabu is a very easy inclusion into the S tier. Next up we have Modoc. Modoc came out in February, shortly after the reign of Zabu ended, and is a 5 cost 8 power that reads on reveal, discard your hand. So Modoc is, I think, a great example of a card that completely revitalized and redefined a whole archetype in the game, being discard. This card just makes discard so much better of an archetype, regardless of if you're playing Apocalypse discard or Hela discard. There's just no other discard card that has the same impact like Modoc, as you aren't really having to rely on RNG or managing, what kind of cost cards you have in your hand. Modoc just says your whole hand is getting discarded, and if your deck is built to favorably use that effect, it is just incredibly powerful. It was a huge plus for the Hela deck, as being able to hide Modoc behind Invisible Woman prevented you from discarding your Hela if she was in your hand, and being able to guarantee you're going to get all the other big things coming back. And then for Apocalypse, being able to just dump your hand down has been really, really good, not only for generating copies of Swarm or getting Wolverines into play, but also to make sure you don't have any cards you don't want in hand, giving you a poor chance of your Dracula not hitting the big thing you want it to. I don't think the discard archetype as a whole would be as remotely competitive or fun without this card, so for that reason, I think it's an easy include into the A tier. Next up, we have the March Season Pass card, Nimrod. Nimrod is a 5 cost 6 power that reads, when this card is destroyed, add copies of it to the other location. So Nimrod was actually a 5 power card when it released, and this was one of the more underwhelming Season Pass cards at the time of it coming out. It just really was not fitting in a lot of decks. I think really the only deck that ended up using this was some iterations of Galactus, but even then Galactus was stronger than it is now, as you didn't have the same condition of having to win the lane. So Galactus had other ways of winning, like with Death or Null, and you really didn't need to use Nimrod to win. It was more of just kind of a backup plan. I think this is a card a lot of people ended up skipping on in the Season Pass, and then a couple months later, when the metagame had changed and the card had gotten buffed, it started seeing a bit more play in destroy-focused archetypes. The Venom buff is another one that was pretty big for this card. Venom having a bit more power in general was a good thing for Nimrod, as eating a big Nimrod and then getting to keep that power was really nice. I think overall it's a neat design, and I'm glad it ended up finding a home in Destroy, even if it has never been the most powerful Destroy card of the bunch. For all those reasons, I think Nimrod is an easy inclusion into the B tier. Next up is HitMonkey, the April Season Pass card. HitMonkey is a 3 cost 2 power that reads, on reveal, gain +2 power for each other card you've played this turn. HitMonkey kind of turned the metagame on its head. When it launched, it was originally a 2-0 instead of a 3-2, and it was a core part of what made Bounce one of the most dominating archetypes we've seen in the history of Marvel Snap. This was a card a lot of players expected to be powerful, but even then, I think some people underrated just how strong this card was, particularly with its interaction with things like Mysterio, and especially alongside Bast, who not only buffed its power, but turned all the Mysterio bodies into 3 power cards on their own. It's just actually crazy how big you could get your HitMonkey to be going into the final turn of the game when you're dumping out all your cards. Even with counters popping up like Wave and Sandman, Bounce was able to adapt get out their HitMonkey early when it was 2 cost, as you could just tempo out Mysterio and HitMonkey on 4, and adapting the late game to include things like Iron Man on turn 5, into closing out with Chavez on turn 6, which was mainly run for the consistency of drawing your early powerful bounce cards, but happened to be decent when you could only play 1 card on the final turn of the game. HitMonkey is a card that has defined not only bounce, but the Sarah control archetype, and overall I think it is deserving of the spot in the A tier. Next up, we have the season pass for the Guardian season in May, and that is Nebula. Nebula is a 1/1 that reads, whenever your opponent doesn't play a card here, gain +2 power, except the turn this is played. So Nebula is a really interesting one, and I think she would be probably an easy S tier inclusion if she wasn't being overshadowed by one of the other best 1-drops in the game, who acts as pretty much a perfect counter to her in Kitty Pryde. We actually had a very short window of seeing just how powerful Nebula could be in a world without Kitty Pryde, as even though Kitty was released before Nebula, Kitty was disabled due to bugs for an extended period of time, so we had about 2 weeks of Nebula without Kitty existing, and man was she crazy. Now, in a world where Kitty decks are a very popular part of the metagame, she isn't seeing quite as much play as she used to. However, she is still a mainstay include in decks like the High Evolutionary or Sandman Ramp. The card is definitely still incredibly powerful and is really thematic in terms of its design, being kind of an opposite effect of the normal Guardians, so for those reasons, I'm going to be putting it in A tier. Next up, we have Ghost Spider, who launched back in June. Ghost Spider is a 1-cost 2 power that reads, on reveal, the last card you played moves here. This card was originally a 2-cost 3 power upon its release, and though it did have some very powerful synergy with move and giving move decks a way to move cards to the right finally, it really didn't move the needle enough to make move decks a very relevant part of the overall metagame, and unfortunately, not much has changed with that even after the card got buffed to a 1/2. Even though move decks have finally started to succeed a bit more, Ghost Spider has not been the reason for that, and I am hopeful that this new buff to the card will make her relevant at some point in time, but for the time being, I think she's a bit underwhelming, even though the effect is definitely something that I think will be powerful in the long term as more move cards get added. So for those reasons, I'm going to be putting Ghost Spider down in the C tier. Next up is the Phoenix Force, our July season pass card, and oh man, do I have some things to say about this one. Phoenix Force is a 4-cost 5 power that reads, on reveal, revive one of your destroyed cards and merge with it. That card can move each turn. So I think conceptually the idea behind this card is really cool. It's thematic and it encourages merging 2 archetypes together in move and destroy. On paper, those all sound like good things. When this card originally released, it was a 5-cost 6 power, and it was by far one of the worst cards in the game, as you had to build your deck in a really awkward way to take advantage of it, and if you drew the wrong half of your deck, or you just didn't draw your Phoenix Force, it all fell apart. The other really unfortunate thing about this card is it was bugged on release, and as of the recording of this video, is still bugged to this very day. This was actually a confirmed bug over on the Marvel Snap Discord, but if you manage to make a copy of Phoenix Force through something like Zola or resurrecting a multiple man and then moving it, the copies of the Phoenix Force cannot currently move. It honestly blows my mind how one of the very few main interactions and synergies this card had was broken on release and still hasn't been fixed 3 months later. And it's pretty disappointing that a core interaction of what the card is supposed to be able to do just simply doesn't work still. I hope they can fix that bug in the future. Maybe it'll give Phoenix Force a bit of a fighting chance, but for the time being, this one is going down in D tier. Next up, we have Dakin, the season pass card of August, and Dakin is a 3-cost 4 power that reads, on reveal, add the Murmasa shard to your hand. Murmasa shard is a 1/1 that when it is discarded or destroyed, you get to double Dakin's power. So I definitely have a little bit of bias with this card. I expected to like this card a lot because I really like Thor. The idea of creating another card and then making use of that to buff the original card I think is very cool conceptually. But to be honest, I didn't really have a whole ton of fun with this card. However, being objective about it, I think it was a pretty well-balanced season pass card and something people generally did seem to enjoy. It's cool how it works in both discard and destroy, so there's a variety of options in terms of what you can do with it, rather than just shoving it in, you know, the one deck that makes sense for it, or the one archetype that synergizes with it well. So I hope we see more designs like that, as I think it encourages some interesting and different deck building than we're used to seeing in Snap. Putting my personal bias aside, I think Dakin is a pretty easy include to the B tier. Not top tier by any means, however, interesting card and one that I think players have generally enjoyed playing with while being fairly well balanced. And last but certainly not least, we have Loki. So Loki. I have not felt as strongly about a card being broken since the original Zabu season. Loki is a 3-cost, 5 power that reads, replace your hand with cards from your opponent's starting deck. They cost 1 less. This card is broken. I know a lot of people are like, oh, just counter it. The amount of mana cheat this enables is at least on par, if not better, than the original pre-nerf Zabu. The fact that your opponent is able to cheat out just such a crazy amount of cards, and the fact that we have so much card generation so that when you play Loki, you often have a hand of 5 or 6 cards, is just actually insane. The idea, I think, here is that, well, you're getting cost reduction, but the problem with that is, especially with the Snow Guard buff too, it's so easy to generate a really big hand, so you're often getting essentially half of your opponent's deck, and when you combine his already powerful mana cost reduction with a card like Quinjet to enable 2 cost reduction, it just gets really, really stupid really quickly. Also, mirror matches with this card are some of the most toxic game experiences I've ever had in Marvel Snap. It essentially boils down to, oh, if they have the Collector and they have Loki, if you generate more Lokis than your opponent, you're probably going to win. Why is this card a 3/5? Why is it overstated for being one of the best mana cheating cards in the game? If this is a 3/5, Sarah should be a 3/5. Like, it's ridiculous. This card, I think, is going to get severely nerfed after the season ends. Maybe if we're lucky before then, but I doubt it. But I think the idea of the card is interesting and thematic, and if you make it more expensive to play, or if you find a way to reduce just how crazy the mana cheating it enables is, it could be a fine card for the game. I'm really hoping they end up in a situation where it still ends up being a powerful card that can be an archetype defining card, like we've seen in Zabu, but not one where it is as stupidly broken as it is right now, having warped the metagame to a pretty bad spot. For those reasons, Loki is probably the easiest include in S tier that I can think of. And boom, there we have it. Just over a year's worth of Marvel Snap Season Pass cards in a tier list. So obviously this is subjective. I'm sure not everyone's going to agree with my ratings, and I'd like to hear what other people think about these cards. Did you think something was rated too highly or rated too low? Let me know in the comments below. And overall, what do you think of the Season Pass system in Marvel Snap? Do you like it? Are there things you wish would change about it? I'd love to hear it. But that's going to wrap it up for this video. If you enjoyed it, remember to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.